Hillel team, I'll let you decide when to let people in.
It's 7, so we can let them in a minute at 7:01.
Olga, you've got that?
Yes, we'll let them in now. I'm gonna start letting people in right now.
You ready, Luna? Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm John Stewart, Distinguished University Professor of Architecture and Associate Dean for Cultural and Community Engagement and Executive Director of FIU's Miami Beach Urban Studios. On behalf of Hillel FIU, the Jewish Museum of Florida FIU, and the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Program at FIU, it's my pleasure to welcome you to FIU's annual Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Week. Every year, we organize and present a diverse series of events during this week to educate the community and inspire thought, action, and greater civic engagement. Now, as we know, more than ever, this awareness is sorely needed. Tonight's readings and conversations are co-sponsored by our wonderful partners, the Betsy South Beach, and feature poets William Heyen, Joy Ladin, and Geoffrey Philp, in that order. And the event will be moderated by the Betsy's Vice President for Arts and Community, Dr. Deborah Plutzik-Briggs, representing her family here tonight as active FIU ambassadors and champions of the art in South Florida. Throughout tonight's presentations, we encourage you, members of the audience, to post questions in the chat box that will be posed to our panelists. If we're unable to get to your question, we will forward it to the speaker it was intended for. So please don't think you've been overlooked. And before inviting Deborah to introduce our poets, I'd like to share a comment by Holocaust survivor and author Elie Wiesel, which cogently summarizes why we are here. And I'm quoting, "For the dead and the living, we must bear witness. For not only are we responsible for the memories of the dead, we are also responsible for what we are doing with those memories," end quote. I know our subject matter is heavy tonight, and it's been heavy all day. Yet despite its sadness, we hope you'll find purpose and inspiration in the work of our special guests, poets William Heyen, Joy Ladin, and Geoffrey Philp. Deborah will now formally introduce them, and we'll get our evening underway. Deborah, it's always good to see you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, John. And thank you to all of the affiliated FIU departments and organizations that have invited us to take part this evening. On behalf of my family who own and operate the Betsy and who believe deeply in FIU as a leading institution and in poetry as an art form with a unique capacity to connect people and communities, I'm so delighted to welcome our 3 guest poets for the evening: Bill Heyen, Joy Ladin, and Geoffrey Philp. Each of our poets will read for 8 or 10 minutes from selections of their own choosing that they feel honors the intent of the evening and is broadly representative of their body of work. Following the first round of poems, as time permits, we're going to pose questions to each of them about their work to focus on the unique ways they use words. Equally important and interesting are the aspects of Holocaust and genocide they deal with directly and indirectly in their poetry, and we'll ask them about that. We're going to hope to gain perspectives on poetry as a force to teach and to remember. I will introduce each poet before they read and encourage them to provide their own short introductions about themselves and about aspects of the poetry that will make their presentations more meaningful to you. The esteemed poet William Heyen is going to read first. Bill Heyen is Professor of English and Poet in Residence Emeritus at the College of Brockport and has won awards from the NEA, the Guggenheim, the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters. He's won a Pushcart and so many other awards. His masterpiece, Shoah Train, released by Etruscan Press, was a finalist for the National Book Award, and he has received wide acclaim for The Candle, Poems of Our 20th Century Holocausts. His work has also been included in hundreds of anthologies, journals, and magazines. In the next 3 months, Mammoth Books will release a beautiful hardcover book with 50 years of Heyen's poems that include hundreds of Holocaust poems. And the book can be ordered online or through our partner at Books and Books. Archibald MacLeish described Heyen's The Swastika poems as having discipline and honesty and courage and restraint. About Heyen's collaborative work, Falling from Heaven, Holocaust Poems of a Jew and a Gentile, Maya Angelou wrote that it is a painful and poignant offering which reminds me that none of us has survived the Holocaust without scars, and it gives us hope that we can avoid a reoccurrence of such horror. It's my pleasure now to introduce you to William Heyen.
Well, thank you, Deborah. And it's a privilege to be here with all of you on this occasion, which is solemn and maybe which is celebratory at the same time. So thank you all. I'll begin with a statement from Susan Sontag that I've used a couple of times as epigraph to some of my Holocaust poems, and it has meant a lot to me over the years. She says, "The supreme tragic event of modern times is the murder of the 6 million European Jews. In a time which is not lacked in tragedies, this event most merits that unenviable honor by reason of its magnitude, unity of theme, historical meaningfulness, and sheer opaqueness. Ultimately, the only response is to continue to hold the event in mind, to remember it. This capacity to assume the burden of memory is not always practical. Sometimes remembering alleviates grief or guilt. Sometimes it makes it worse. Often it may not do any good to remember, but we may feel that it is right or fitting or proper. This moral function of remembering is something that cuts across the different worlds of knowledge, action, and art." So I've studied that paragraph over the years. She mentions the sheer opaqueness of the Holocaust. And I think that's where poetry comes in, where we begin to tell stories rhythmically and imagistically and suggest things that are beyond our rational ability to understand. But I don't know about these things. Anyway, the moral function of remembering. I've got a half a dozen poems picked out to read, and I'll try to be very conscious of the time. This may be my darkest poem, and it's a very short one. This is called The Killers. As I dream, a gas chamber forms. Light awakens inside it. Otherwise, that space is empty. Its doors swing shut. Gas drops in. Gas fills the chamber. The light is being gassed. The killers are killing the light. So there it is, light as an image for us of the possible evolution of human beings toward togetherness and humaneness. But again, quickly, as I dream, a gas chamber forms, light awakens inside it. Otherwise, that space is empty. Its doors swing shut. Gas drops in, gas fills the chamber. The light is being gassed. The killers are killing the light. So there we are at this, it seems to me. There's a writer, Arthur Cohen, who has a book called The Tremendum, and he talks about the Holocaust as a tremendum, although other people might have other tremendums. That is the thing in our human history, in our beings, that most affects us and is the traumatic event in our lives, either directly experienced or experienced as, I've had to, not being a part of the Holocaust. But that thing that most calls up for us all of the questions about our existence. It seems to me everything in human history for me leads up to the Holocaust and away from it. I have a tendency to talk too much. I've met a lot of Holocaust survivors and have been honored to meet them and have learned a great deal from them. One was Angie Seuss Paul, who passed away some years ago. I was at a lecture of hers, and I began to take notes. This poem, called Fugue vor Kristallnacht, consists entirely of her phrases, maybe not in the order in which she delivered them, but every word here is hers. And she was glad to have me do this and welcomed it. This is called Fugue vor Kristallnacht. Again, every phrase is from Angie. Around the corner where I lived, a beautiful synagogue was burning. Around the corner where I lived, around the corner, a beautiful synagogue was burning where I lived. Around the corner where I lived, a beautiful synagogue was burning. My father came home in the evening. I didn't recognize him. He didn't want to talk and didn't talk. What happened to him was burning. He didn't want to talk and didn't talk. What happened to him? A beautiful synagogue where I lived. He didn't want to talk and didn't talk. What happened to him? Will they kill me is not so easy to forget either. I didn't recognize him. Came home in the evening. Around the corner where I lived, will they kill me? Was burning. He didn't want to talk. What happened to him? Will they kill me is not so easy to forget either. A beautiful synagogue was burning. What happened to him? We packed the little things, what we could carry. My father said, we didn't know we are going. Who will live, will die. He didn't want to talk. My father came home in the evening. I didn't recognize him. Will they kill me? Around the corner where I lived, what we could carry, we packed. Who will live, will die. Around the corner, a beautiful synagogue. I didn't recognize him, my father. What happened to him was burning. Will they kill me is not so easy. The little things, what we could carry, was burning. Around the corner where I lived, a beautiful synagogue was burning. She said, and I took this down directly, where we are going, who will live, will die. Just a little something left out there in the pure English. Who will live, will die. And she expressed for me that whole feeling that so many survivors have had of being dead within life. I could talk about this for a long time and give other examples and things like that, but who will live, will die. I have a poem about Charlotte Delbo about that. Anyway, here is my reaction to a reading by another Holocaust survivor. These aren't her words, but it's about her as she spoke. Her name is Chana, C-H-A-N-A, Michaeli. I'd lost touch with her 10 or 20 years ago. But she gave a talk at Brockport, and this is what I came away with. It's called The Secret. The survivor spoke. I began to hear. Not her cattle car, 4 eternal days from Budapest, the dead buried under luggage in one corner. I'd heard this before. Not the shorning, the aberrant showers, the corpse stink of soup. I'd heard this before. Not the electrified barbed wire, but as though her sentences shorted themselves out, phrases that buzzed and crackled under her breastbone barracks. Not music, the gaunt band playing The Walking Dead off to slave labor, back from slave labor. I'd heard this before, or tried to, but red streaks of voice across an ionized atmosphere, gassed Hungarian claw hair and rib nails and tongues, a burst heart breaking into static as she spoke, into canceling sparks, her now never-ending speechlessness, never. And that raises so many questions about how we transcribed the testimonies of Holocaust survivors. Again, another very complex issue. This is called Catbird. For me, the Catbird was always a jazz singer. Anyway, this ends one of my Holocaust books, Catbird. Another thick book of testimonies. I knew I could not remember them all. It was as though the survivors were moving past me in a line, and I were choosing among them, that way to oblivion, this way into a poem with my rhythmic baton. But this spring morning, a catbird sang outside my door while I was reading, while Rabbi Solomon H. remembered his son, a 9-year-old who had, Solomon tells us, half the book of Psalms by heart. When he was taken to be murdered, he was saying the Psalms from memory. Just before being gassed, the boy said, I am still going to pray to God. Maybe at the last moment, we will still be saved. And I looked up and, as catbirds will, this one kept singing like crazy, its song losing track of its beginning, never the melodies of final meanings, but going on as though nothing within its own singing could ever not remember everything. Just two more and I'll get out of the way. This was a follow-up poem, in a sense, written maybe 10 or 20 years later. It's called Shoah Train, Spring Coda. This isn't blood in my pen, or semen, or venom. It's not mercury or coal soot mixed with saliva, but it's liquid. It's that same catbird's song of the dead, isn't it not? It's remembering, it's listening, as if the rabbi's son were still reciting, as if somewhere in the Psalms, if he could only come to it, as if, having come to it, their lives might still be saved, as if the catbird's voice could someday rasp something like this. And I'll read one more. You know, there's so much to say, and there's nothing. I remember that in one of his books, Elie Wiesel says that he knew a rabbi who was silent even while speaking. And maybe that's what poetry tries to do too, you know. The poems have to be smarter than we are. As Archibald MacLeish said, and go on thinking about themselves longer than we do. And I like my poems when I can read it and say, what's going on there? Get something out of it, and then read it again and hear something else going on there. Anyway, this is a wild poem spoken by someone who is desperate to remember. I think he's half crazy, at least. It's called Art. Listen to this guy. To approximate a mass grave, I bulldozed mud, bone meal, maggots into a viscous conglomerate, then into a glass box the size of a cattle car. I piped in classical music, Beethoven, Brahms, Wagner, and authentic recordings of trains clacking on murderers' tracks. I bought my mud in Poland, stained glass in France, found bone meal in Deutschland, buckets of maggots by chance when I dug beneath an altar into a cess of flesh and hair and scripture. So far, so good, but my work seemed too stark. This inspired me to wire 3 black light bulbs to be switched on or off as with a work of art. The first to illuminate its roof, the second its lowest layers, the third its sacred heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you so much for sharing your work. For anyone in the audience with questions for Bill, I urge you to send them via the chat. And as John mentioned, we will get to those questions. Joy Ladin will read next. I'm going to kick off my formal introduction of her life and work with her own words. Yet with her permission, I'm going to ask you to think of the I in the quote I'm going to read as each one of us here tonight. I also want everyone to know that I'm the one who added the word poets to this quote. Here's what Joy said. What I want to see is that when we think of we, that includes transgender Jews and poets. I want people to engage in the serious work of imagining our perspectives and engaging us in real conversation. I hope we can even shift the idea from we want you to be here with us to you are us. I want people to understand that seriously engaging with trans Jews and poets isn't just a responsibility. It brings incredible opportunity too. Beautiful, Joy. Joy is widely known for the moving memoir, Through the Door of Life, which details her coming to terms with her own identity and her own destiny, and choosing to live, to thrive, and to inspire us all. She's the author of 9 poetry collections and holds the David and Ruth Gottesman Chair in English at Yeshiva University. A nationally recognized speaker on gender and Jewish identity, Joy is a sought-after speaker and activist who will be reading from the Book of Anna, which will be re-released in 2021. And by the way, Joy is an alumnus of the Betsy Writers Room, and that is where we met. Here's a bit about Joy's The Book of Anna, which was first published by Sheep Meadow in 2007 and is being reissued in a new edition in March. The book is written in the voice of a fictional character, Anna Asher, the daughter of a briefly famous pianist who spent her adolescence in a concentration camp and is writing in 1950s Prague, where she works as a receptionist for the secret police. This genre-defying book combines prose diary entries that offer intimate glimpses of Anna's present, her writing process, relationships with neighbors, obsessive sexual behavior, chain smoking, and idiosyncratic exploration of Jewish tradition, with autobiographical poems, each made out of bits of different sacred Jewish texts that recount her unsparing efforts to reckon with horror, survival, and their aftermath. Joy will tell us more, and so it's my pleasure to introduce you now to Joy Ladin.
Thank you so much, Deborah. It's an honor to be here. Anna is one of the kinds of survivors that Bill Heyen was referring to, where surviving doesn't mean being fully alive or ever living without death. She's using writing to try to figure out if there is a form for her experience and life that will enable her to continue to live. And it's not clear as the book goes on whether she is or isn't going to kill herself. But the poem that I'm going to read is the first one in the book when she's just beginning this. It's called Tamar because the sacred text that she is weaving, actually appropriating to tell her story is the story in the Bible of Judah's daughter-in-law, who married two of his sons. Each of the sons died before they could consummate the marriage. The law of levirate marriage meant that the next one up kept having to go. He only had one son left. He was not eager to have that marriage take place. So he locked Tamar in a house. He wouldn't let her out. She was a widow and was supposed to wait, and he wouldn't let her marry either. She decided that she would take matters into her own hands and snuck out of the house, dressed as a prostitute, and waited by the side of the road where she knew her father-in-law would be traveling. He has sex with her, not knowing who she is, and he can't pay her, so he gives her his staff to identify him as a pledge that he'll send his the payment to her. But of course, he tries to pay her, but nobody knows of a prostitute there. 9 months later, or probably 7 months later, he realizes that she's been having sex, and he says, take her out and let her be burnt, and in front of the whole clan. And she holds out the staff and she says, by whose staff this is, I am with child. And he recognizes the staff and realizes that he's the father, and her life is spared. She has twins, and one of the twins becomes the ancestor of King David. And King David in Jewish tradition is the ancestor of the Messiah. Anna's father's name is David, and she says that there's a cock and bull story in her family that her father was the last of the line of David. So if there's going to be a Messiah, that has to come through her. The poem is triggered when she hears that a man who raped her is alive and well in a city nearby, and that triggers a sort of a traumatic replay of the events, but they're tangled up for her with Tamar's story. Okay. Tamar. He lives, I hear, outside Cologne, in a place that resembles heaven as water resembles glass. He lives. I hear, outside a place that resembles heaven as Cologne resembles glass, the crack of a black brass-tipped staff. I hear he lives, doused with cologne. Cologne drips from the springs in his bed. I hear Spring's brass-tipped staff cracking ice that resembles heaven as water resembles glass. Cologne drips from a ceiling crack. He lives here, a brass-tipped staff, sweating cologne and shards of glass, ready to spring. I hear heaven crack. He came, as always, drenched in cologne, prodding our rags to distinguish the skeleton that pleased him. I knew him by his staff, the one whose name began with J, the Lord of life and death. I knelt a little too far forward, as though adjusting a sandal strap. The staff tapped closer, crack, crack, crack. I didn't dare look up, but I smelt his hands. The Lord remembered me. I conceived, vomited. Word was brought that against all laws, I was growing fat. He didn't know which one I was. We tasted the same to him. He lit a cigarette, sucked, ground it into my breast. Give us a name, he said. Cologne mixed with the smell of burning flesh. There was a crack above his head. It widened painfully, disgorged something blind and soft, like a rabbit. The slap cleared my head. The cologne-soaked hand of the Lord of life and death The hand of the man who planted seed in David's womb slapped the last of David's line, in whom Messiah waited. I'm not a whore, I said. He laughed, sucked, fit the blind red tip to the hole in my breast. The ceiling cracked, disgorged. I didn't faint again. Squeezed the silver crucifix I stole from him into his open hand. He dropped the cigarette. Out, he shouted. The others left. We waited, the tiny, tarnished God pinned between life and death, and I, and the last of David's line, curled beneath my breasts, for the Lord to close his hand. Then only I was left, squeezing the rusted spring he'd ripped from under a bed, getting rid of it. One leg fell off when I washed him down. It gleamed like soap in a dream, like ice in a dream. I've soaked my parts 11 years, and still they don't come clean. One leg fell off. The toes were webbed. It wasn't fully human. Something fogged the room. Frankincense and cumin. One leg fell off when I washed him down, bright like a cruse of oil from a temple for a god the size of a carpenter's testicle. One leg fell off. It was the Lord's. I turned up the water. Sonderkommando of the soul. Anna, David's daughter. Thank you.
Beautiful, Joy. Thank you so much. I want to remind everyone once again, please send questions for Joy and Bill. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our last visiting poet for the evening, Mr. Geoffrey Philp. Geoffrey Philp is a Jamaican poet, a Marcus Garvey scholar who lives in Miami and is the author of 6 poetry collections. Recently, discovering that his maternal grandmother was Jewish, he has been working with the New Voices Project, which focuses on the moral lessons of the Holocaust. His poem, Flying African, has become part of their PSA for a forthcoming book, New Voices, Contemporary Writers Confronting the Holocaust. Geoffrey will premiere a new set of poems for this reading, and he is a 2-time alumnus of the Betsy Writers Room. And I will say also that Geoffrey is one of 12 poets whose work is on the Betsy Poetry Rail, as one of 12 writers that has shaped Miami history through his writing. He will read from 3 bodies of work, with some of the poems, as I mentioned, being read in public for the first time tonight. And he's also going to share a few images to inform his reading. So I'm going to ask that the first image be shared now. It is of the Holocaust Memorial, designed by the great architect Kenneth Treaster. It's located in Miami Beach. Geoffrey took this image himself, and it was then that he was inspired to write this poem that is called Distant Cousins.
So thank you, Deborah. Never in a million years did I ever think I would be invited to read these wonderful poets and scholars on Holocaust Remembrance Day. So I'm going to begin with the poem, Distant Cousins, which describes the events that started me on my journey. Distant cousins. The doubts remained with me these many years. Maybe we are part Jewish, and returned when I tried to escape the endless construction on the beach, and ended up on Meridian in front of this monument I could no longer avoid, any more than the plea from a stranger. Our DNA suggests that we are related with a 90% surety. Please help me find our Sephardic ancestors. Under the shade of bougainvillea, where I could barely see the fingers of that hand, trying to pluck the sun from the sky, for darkness to cover bronze memorials, for those bodies scattered like ash over a field that had forgotten names buried under grass, trampled by boots that denied the presence of something holy, in hands that broke bread, lips that still whispered prayers to Hashem, who had turned away from the babble of men, who worshipped their reflection when they wiped steam from their mirrors. I trudged down a hallway, narrow as a passage to the door of no return, where one ancestor sold the other for enough silver to buy a pair of shoes, and entered the circle where I could not look up at the bodies, suspended as if in mid-air, out of my fear of vertigo, of falling through time to the first Shoah, or hurtling into a future in which I have no answer to the riddle that haunts the hardiest survivor. Who are you, my son? Except that I have stood in this place, amidst the anguish of Arielites, listening for an Avrit to be named. The next poem is called Canada, and Canada is the name of the warehouses in which the stolen belonging of Jews who were sent to the gas chambers on arrival were stored. Canada. To get through the day, you will need a system. Start with the men's shoes, ones that can be reused without much wear and hold up to any abuse. Collect the women's shoes. You don't have a spare second, especially if you find children's shoes in a pram. You'll begin bawling faster than the time it takes a couple to march over, grab your hair, beat you unconscious, because you stopped to wonder. How many seders did they attend, where the Haggadah was recited to her sons, whether they were wise, wicked, simple, or had to be told about Hashem's deliverance of our people in Egypt? How many tears do we have to shed before our feast in Jerusalem, instead of ending up our journey on a dusty floor in Canada? Thousands of kisses for Chaim Herman. May his memory be a blessing. My dear, I write to you with great risk and danger, with the knowledge that my days are numbered. And know when you receive this, I have been added to the millions of my brothers who have vanished from this world. Each morning brings me closer to the gas chambers, the fires of the crematorium, where what will remain of me is ash, a strand of hair from this balding head that carries so much shame. For the times when we had our misunderstandings, and I did not count my time with you as precious, and allow my anger over trifles to cause you distress. Tonight, my dear wife, I ask for your forgiveness, embrace you for the last time, and then thousands of kisses. The Warsaw Ghetto Chronicler, to Hillel Seidman, may his memory be a blessing. After I ripped the yellow armband and limped towards a company of soldiers, armed with chocolates that finished off the rest of us that dysentery had spared, I wrapped my tefillin around my arms and forehead and asked the soldier if he had seen any temple left standing. He stomped out his cigarette with the heel of his boot and stared at me as if I had finally succumbed to madness, as if this war was not insanity. And he replied, "How can you still believe when you're surrounded by so many dead, stacked like cords of wood in the yard, like kindling? But I, like my father and my forefathers, may their memories be a blessing, answered his question with my questions. Where were your leaders who knew before the liquidation of Warsaw that we were scheduled for murder? Where were the family men, neighbors, who planned picnics where they'd gawk and place bets on which of the condemned would die first? And when the bodies were cut down, they rushed to the gallows to poke into mouths, finger any opening they could find to sate their envy, their greed for Jewish gold. Where were the women and men created in the image of Hashem to manifest justice in this world of shards, yet they walked away to attend their gardens? I left him to ponder that Hidot, in the hope that one day he would become a wise son, and joined my 9 brothers, to mourn our martyrs. The rapport Fura and the dancer, for Francesca Mann. May her memory be a blessing. Some say she was an actor, others a dancer. No one knows for certain, for in a time of war, who can be sure of anything? What we do know is that with her blue black hair, which reached down to her shoulders, and the way she held her head, as resolute as the widow Judith, she stood out from the scarecrows that wandered the camp as aimlessly as Musulmen, lost in the pangs of hunger, resigned to their death. So when the rapport Führer, Schillinger, decided to humiliate her, as he had done to so many mothers, and ordered her to take off her clothes in front of the guards, she started to dance, which made us think, when we repeated the story, that maybe she was a dancer, lifting her skirt high enough for him to see her suspenders, and undoing her stockings that caught the guard's attention. But it wasn't until she was down to her brassiere and leaned against a pillar when Schillinger, dragging the whip that hung limply from his wrist, lurched towards her, that she slipped off her shoe, spiked him in the right eye, grabbed his gun and shot him, so that when he fell, he bowed as so many had done before our judges, his body like a bloodied rag, trampled by her feet. The image of Jesse Owens. Thank you. I have to thank Howard Debs, the CEO of the New Voices Project, for including this poem in the anthology, New Voices: Contemporary Writers Confronting the Holocaust. Flying African. Jesse, I can hardly imagine the weight on your shoulders as you filed through the stadium, flags flapping in the wind, nervous soldiers marching behind to protect you from crowds of young girls screaming, "Wo ist Jesse?" While up in the stands, the Führer received adulation from his adoring audience, then sat and joked with his captains about the superior genes of their athletes, crouched in the shadow of a fence where starved faces would soon peer through barbed wire. But on that day, you exposed the lie that had stalked you through segregated hotels and restrooms with signs that read "whites only," and ran as if you were striding the air, away from their hate, like your grandfather did when he left the South, away from the flaming crosses and hooded Klansmen, following his dream of freedom, like in the story of our ancestors, which was passed from mouth to hand, in barbershops, soup kitchens, stoops in Harlem, about the flying Africans, tired of scars, whips, chains, the massa's thunder, who stomped their feet, raised their hands above their heads and sang, "Today, we're going home to Mount Zion." And the last poem, The Shofar of Auschwitz. Rosh Hashanah 1944, for Haskell Tidor. May his memory be a blessing. It may not be a miracle like on Hanukkah, but finding the shofar days before Rosh Hashanah, when the Talmud teaches that Joseph was freed from prison on the first day of the new year, when the impossible is possible if we stay open, made us think that maybe this was a sign Hashem had not abandoned us to our murderers. So in spite of the death, disease, and torture that plagued the lager, we're to perform a mitzvah like the Mishlach Manot or teaching the Pirkei Avot, could be rewarded by the fascists with a bullet to the back of my head. But I didn't care. The shofar on my lips, I blew as if my life depended on it. And again, a year later, 3 miles off the coast of Eretz Israel, as if to say, we're still here. We're still here. The tribe lives on. Thank you.
Thank you to our poets. We're going to move on to the Q&A section of the evening. And I'm going to start with a question for Bill. Bill, do you remember when you discovered your family's Nazi past?
Well, I remember when I was a boy, when my father heard that his 2 brothers had been killed on the German side. I didn't understand much about it, but I knew he was hurt there. And in my first book, Depth of Field, published by LSU in 1970, I have poems to those 2 German uncles. One of them was a Nazi, as I came to understand it, who died with the Luftwaffe. The other one was, after whom I was named, was just a sucker of a foot soldier who was killed in Holland. But so I had 2 poems in my first book, and then I began to become immersed in the Holocaust, the Third Reich, Hitler, just read everything, and I felt that this was this had to be central to my being.
How long after that did you start responding through your work and poetry?
Well, I think my first, and after Depth of Field, I seem, if I look back at myself, to have alternated between writing nature poems and writing poems about the Holocaust and the Second World War. And I think I was keeping my uncertain balance by doing that. But I think that the swastika poems came out in 1978, I think. So I was at it pretty steadily for some years, reading and writing, raising the same questions to myself. What if I'd been born in Berlin in 1920 instead of in Brooklyn in 1940? I might very well have aspired to the SS. Could I have resisted all of that propaganda coming at me? Some people did, but I was tall, strong, an athlete. I would have aspired to the SS probably. So it just raised all kinds of questions about evil to me, the mystery of iniquity. And now, over the last 10 or 15 years, every time I think I've had my last say with one of these poems, all of a sudden, maybe in a couple of weeks, one will just declare itself because of something I've read or something I've dreamed.
I think that Luna might be frozen. Hello? Yes?
Luna, where are you?
Yeah,
Yes.
yes, she's frozen.
Yes. Okay. Bill, thank you for that beautiful answer. I'm going to ask Joy a question now. Joy, do you feel that the world has paid sufficient attention to the atrocities that befell members of the LGBTQ community during the Shoah?
No, I don't. And one of the things that I sort of belatedly realized as I was growing up in America was that it was the Holocaust that had made anti-Semitism uncool in the United States. My parents, I grew up in a house that, like most houses in America, the property deeds have covenants in them that bar them from being sold to many different kinds of people, usually including Jews, always including people of color. But I think the neighborhood had opened up after the war, but nothing similar happened with LGBTQ people. There was no similar reckoning where the world said, oh my God, if Nazis are gonna do mass killings of gay men and gay women, and we have to turn away from that. We have to stop doing that. In fact, they've never stopped doing that. Queer people are still killed, certainly every couple of weeks, sometimes more often in the United States. In Chechnya, there's been a horrific campaign to round up and disappear, particularly gay men, and deny that gay men ever existed. I was in Uganda, where corrective rape is still commonly practiced when women come out as lesbian. Gangs of boys will go to them and fix them by raping them. And I met a trans activist who was later killed. And in fact, in many countries, there have been more countries with where there are death penalties for being gay or trans. And so these are all of the signs. That's the reckoning that I think is the most important. All of the memorializing in the history, all of that is important. But the fundamental thing that's important is exactly what Bill was saying. The most important way to me to memorialize the Holocaust is to say, oh my God, this is something that human beings are capable of.
Right.
That I'm capable of, that my culture is capable of. Do I want this to be me? Do I want this to be us? And deciding for that not to be. And there just has not been a clear reckoning in terms of violence against LGBTQ people. There's never a final reckoning, right? Anti-Semitism didn't disappear anywhere after this. But it's more like what we need to be doing is the kind of wrestling that Bill is talking about. And that is still early days, I think.
Mhm. Thank you. Luna, you're back.
Yes.
Would you
Sorry,
like to
everyone.
proceed with Geoffrey?
Yes, Geoffrey, our last question is for you. Can you talk to us about how it feels to be addressing the Shoah through your poetry now that you have discovered your Jewish heritage? Is the lens different now?
Well, it's all been very strange for this. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So it's been very strange for this Black Jew from Jamaica who grew up listening to the music of Bob Marley. And yet in this time when we've seen the rise of fascism, insurrectionists storming the Capitol, and the growth of neo-Nazis, the lessons that the Shoah can teach us about modernism, colonialism, racism, and in particular anti-Semitism, they seem almost ready-made for this time. Timothy Snyder has written a new book about tyranny. I forget the title right now, but every time I read it, and especially with his other book, Black Earth, it seems as if we are almost preparing for another con man to come across, to come along, and to resurrect the big lie, 10, 20 years from now, which is why my grandchildren, my grandniece need to know this story, because another big lie is out there, and we have to be on guard against these big lies and counter them with truth.
Absolutely. Thank you,
Thank
Geoffrey, and thank you to all our readers. I'm going to hand it back over to Deborah.
Yes. Thank you, Geoffrey, and to all of you for those really thoughtful responses. And to others who've posed questions that we aren't asking tonight, I just want to assure you that we will pass them on to the respective poets, and you will be heard. It has really been a pleasure to host this reading tonight. Such a privilege to have gathered 3 stellar poets in one place to remember the many millions whose lives were lost. My thanks once again to our community partners for inviting the Betsy here tonight as the convener of these voices. And so, how to bring this beautiful evening to a close? I'm going to answer that by sharing one more poem. This one is called Requiem for Edward Carrig. And actually, it's written by my father, Heyen, who was a soldier in World War II. This is just a section of the poem. Nighttime in the earth. The body settles patiently into eternity. Time moves, yes, but like glacial ice. The tireless eyes stare out of the sky, answering nothing. And the silence is august and terrible. Nothing can be done, but something can be said, at least. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Deborah. That was really very moving and amazing. And I don't even think thank yous are enough for Bill, Joy, and Geoffrey, and the amazing just patterns of thinking and language and speech and ethics and morality and all these that you've brought together. It's just been extremely, extremely powerful. And I want to express my deep appreciation to the FIU colleagues who in so many different departmental areas that came together to make this evening possible, and give our thanks to you and our audience who joined to hear us tonight and to pay tribute. If you'd like to acquire any of the books by these poets, we urge you to contact Books and Books or your favorite bookseller. And before we go, I invite everyone to join us at 7 p.m. tomorrow for the next event in the series, a discussion of the film When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit. The film is available for free viewing via the registration link. Registration details and information about the entire week's events can be found in the link posted in the chat. Thank you. I think, yes, Luna just did that. So thank you, everyone. Be safe and have a good night.
Thank you all. I'll be decompressing.